Our final panel today is around Reimagining Revenue Part Two, the Funder Panel. This session will explore the ways funders can help transform the journalistic capabilities of smaller organizations by implementing sustainable funding. This is moderated by Jessica Clark, Dot Connector Studios founder and executive director, someone that I've had the pleasure to work with for the last 4.5 months. She is amazing. Come on up, Jessica Clark.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Andrea, and everyone. It's been really exciting to see all of you here. Shawn and Samaya and Andrea and my colleagues Mark Glazier and Roche Amelia have all been planning this for many months, and so it's very gratifying to be here and to have all of you here and online. And I've had the privilege over the years to work with many funders across the country to reimagine journalism, but it's been particularly meaningful here in my hometown to work with the funders that we're going to hear from in this panel. We have, of course, Shawn Mooring, the program director for the Lenfest Institute for Journalism, Diana Liu, the director of the Knight-Lenfest and Local News Transformation Fund, and on the air, I don't know if I'll be able to see her. There she is. Molly Aguiar, the president of the Independence Public Media Foundation. Now, for those of you who are not deep in the funder conversation like I am, you may not know that philanthropy has been going through its own reckoning, just like journalism. People have been asking philanthropy to be more representative, to think about power dynamics, to be more inclusive, and these three funders have really been exemplary in trying to figure this out, figure out new ways to do it, figure out better ways to do it. So we'll start with Shawn, and we'll hear what each funder's theory of change is, some grants they're excited about, and then we'll talk about some of the challenges.
Thank you so much. And it's so exciting, one, to as Jessica shared and Andrea, that we've been working on this for many months, and really glad to kind of have it come to fruition. And one of the things that, having been at Lenfest now for about 2.5 years, it was an opportunity for me, one, to, as Jessica shared, kind of do this work in my backyard, right? I grew up in West Philly. You know, I always say West Philly born and raised, me and Will Smith is kind of our thing. And, you know, but what it means to look at Philadelphia that is not suffering, right? It's by far not a news desert, right? It's what they call a news jungle, right? It's more than enough entities here, but it's not equitable, right? It's not equitable in the way in which stories are told. It's not equitable in the ownership of news outlets. It's not equitable in kind of the content that's covered. And so what could we do? How can the work that I do make my city better? And so that's one of the things, and so was pleased to have the opportunity to come to Lenfest and look at their model, and given our relationship and structure with the Philadelphia Inquirer, we are required, right, to give funds to the Inquirer. It's part of the ethos, but we also believe in supporting an anchor news organization with it as a part of a healthy ecosystem. But the work that I do is you know, the community-focused work of the Inquirer, and then kind of everything else within the ecosystem. And so the way, as Jim shared a little bit in his opening remarks, the way that we've structured the work in the ecosystem is that we are funding individuals and really building opportunities for individual journalists, individual entrepreneurs, those that are aspiring and emerging, and then that we're supporting organizations, whether that be through the PMFE, Philadelphia Media Founders Exchange, direct grants to organizations, and then, you know, what are we doing to support the Philadelphia ecosystem at large? And so some of the research that you heard about this morning from Talia, sharing that news and information, but then also we engage with the visioning table, you know, so there's an advisory board that informs the work that we do and the investments that we make. And all of those things coupled together allow us to, you know, thoughtfully engage and do this work that is also informed by the community. And so it's not, me sitting on my laurels or resting on, although I'm not a journalist by trade, I've been in philanthropy for over 20 years, doing this work in various communities about social empowerment and, efficacy. And so the ways in which I bring that lens to the work that we do at the Lenfest Institute for Journalism is what I hope we are continuing to kind of build on and look forward to engaging in a conversation.
Thank you, Shawn. Molly, let's hear from you.
All right, thank you. Hi, Jessica. Hi, Shawn. Hi, Diana. I'm sorry I'm not there with you today. Hi to everybody in the audience that I can't see. I'm Molly Aguiar. I'm the president of the Independence Public Media Foundation. We are about a three-year-old. We've been grant making for about 3 years or so in the Philadelphia region. I want to give a shout out to my cherished colleague, Nuela Cabral, who would be in this spot right now if were she not on maternity leave. So she is the program officer for IPMF. So we have a pretty expansive focus on media, not just journalism. So in addition to the local journalism that we do fund, we support filmmaking, we support community history projects, archive projects, movement building, and narrative shift specifically around violence and safety and policing narratives. We also support digital equity initiatives. So I guess the way I would tie these areas together, Jessica, you asked about our theory of change, is we have a focus, I think, on ownership and representation in the media, and also supporting people's right to, I'm going to steal from my friends at Free Press, supporting people's right to connect and communicate. So having reliable, low-cost internet access, access to the hardware, and the skills to navigate digital technology. So our highest priority and commitment is lifting up BIPOC media making, and we focus particularly on small and startup organizations that have been historically denied capital, philanthropic capital. And some of these are organizations that are focused on telling stories with communities that are, sometimes a lot of times ignored, but sometimes vilified even by larger news organizations. And some are grassroots community organizations that are pushing for structural changes in local newsrooms. A lot of, what you've heard about in these panels that would, this coverage that would lead to more accurate and relevant and representative coverage of the communities. And it's really hard to talk about, it's the work that I'm excited about because it feels a little bit like picking favorites, picking a favorite child. I am particularly interested and passionate about the digital equity work. It's not something I have a depth of expertise in. I've been doing work mostly in the local journalism space for the time that I've been in philanthropy. And I think Philadelphia is a really interesting place to experiment with community ownership of the infrastructure for digital equity, the infrastructure to access to the internet and the skills to navigate. So we're working with primarily, we have a number of digital equity grants, but our featured grant in that category is Philadelphia Community Wi-Fi. And we're paying attention to the billions of federal dollars that are about to come to the states for digital equity, and find that there's just a huge opportunity for the whole state of Pennsylvania, and also for all Pennsylvanians. So we're super excited about that.
Thanks, Molly. Diana?
Hello, everyone. I'm Diana Liu. I'm the director of the Knight-Lenfest Local News Transformation Fund. And for folks who are very confused about our branding, I have been working for some time to think about easier ways to explain it. So the latest one I've thought about today is Zoe Kravitz. So very, very well-known parent institutions. But we are a joint venture of the Knight Foundation and the Lenfest Institute for Journalism. We are still our own thing, but the DNA and legacy of our parent institutions are threaded throughout our work and how we operate. So if anybody asks, that's what the Knight-Lenfest Fund is, just say Zoe Kravitz. And everyone's like, oh yeah, I get it. And so what do? We work to empower local news organizations to build trust with their audiences, and when we say audiences, we also mean their communities, and to also develop new revenue streams, all to work on a long-term path to sustainability, with sustainability and equity in complete lockstep with each other. There is a broader definition of sustainability, and that's the approach we're taking. So we don't look at it like, where does DEIB fit within that? It is in the definition of sustainability for us. And how that plays out is that we do work both nationally with a hyper-local focus on Philadelphia, and that's broken down into 3 work streams. And so one is focused on supporting a network, a growing network of news leaders and news organizations that are dealing with the realities of the future, both when we're looking at technology, revenue, business, and culture. And so we look at that really through a change management approach, and a couple of projects that really exemplify that work are the Table Stakes Initiative, which is funded through a variety of different funding partners, but with our work, it's in partnership with API, and by way of that also News Catalyst and the Maynard Institute. That also means things like the Lord Society, which is led by Sierra and Scalawag Media, wherever Sierra might be in the room, or right outside, and that really looks at supporting with a centering on Black and Indigenous women and femmes working in media and journalism, and that is also in support of working and developing skills in the business of news, but also the power of convening and developing strong relationships with each other, and why that's important as a part of change management. And in our next work stream, we work with tools, technology, and product thinking. A lot of that work is embodied by the work of News Catalyst, which Aaron spoke about a little bit. So everything was thoughtfully arranged in this panel so that things were queuing up to this, which is great because you're all media, and News Catalyst, they can speak about themselves a lot better than I can. But Ural Media is another example of just this networked approach that we work on, and again, exploring new sustainable business models, many of which are mutual aid models. And the third work stream for us is the Philadelphia ecosystem. And in line with a lot of what Shawn talked about and his approach and the Lenfest Institute's approach, we're drowning in riches in many ways in Philadelphia, while also grappling with realities like being the poorest major city in America. And so we have a lot of opportunities, and as in a previous panel, there was also the recognition that even in major cities, there are still news deserts in pockets. And so that's one of the things we recognize when there are many key players, but at the same time, there are local publications that are sprouting up. How can we support those? While at the same time, there are many that are still struggling, and what happens in these gaps, and how do we better support organizations to really reach the communities as they move, but also the communities that are trying to stay in place. And all of that fits into the approach and strategy for the Philadelphia ecosystem, which is in civic engagement and thriving communities. So we believe that if we invest in multiple organizations within that community, that will strengthen the ecosystem as a whole. And I think in a nutshell, if we were to say, what does that look like? We fund collaboratives. We fund efforts that reinforce networks and communities of practice. We fund models that I think at times aren't being tested. And some of this also comes with our formation. Again, because we are so young, because we are a joint venture, we don't exist forever. That puts fire behind our behinds to really look at what transformation could look like over 5 years, but that's, we don't fund things ongoing because we don't have the luxury of that. Neither do many of the local news organizations that we're trying to support. And so we really look at things that, if you want to test something, experiment with something, let's talk through what that could look like, and especially if we're talking about new revenue streams. And when our former managing director, Roxanne Stafford, came on board, and she was really developing our learning agenda and our mission and focus, this came from multiple industries. So the grounding and mission of the Knight-Lenfest Fund in how we implement our work has is pulling from Afrofuturism, is pulling from women of and mothers of the industry. It's coming from, Roxanne was a mechanical engineer who worked in the tech and investment space. I'm a city planner. I worked in economic development and also worked in environmental justice. And so we know that the solutions are not only within journalism, and especially if we are also supporting community organizations and citizens committing acts of journalism. Journalists, capital J, are not always the ones with the solutions. And so we want to learn, when we talk about an ecosystem, when we talk about stakeholders and partnerships, there is a broader community that we're a part of, and that all fits into the question of how does news and information fit within a mutual aid framework, so that what we produce, what we put out, how we distribute it, and who produces that work can be uplifting, can be really, really useful, can, at times, if it is a sense of urgency, you know that you have the right information and you're empowered and have agency to do something with it and shape the communities that you're a part of. And that, in a nutshell, is Zoe Kravitz.
I just wanted to be very elegant and, yes, fashion forward. I like the comparison. So philanthropy can be really opaque for people who are reporters, who are publishers, who are not going to these conferences 24/7 like some of us. So we wanted to give the panel a chance to talk about some of the obstacles that they're facing. And I'd also say, I'd offer that you should tell folks how can they connect with you? What is the best way to communicate with the funders in your lives? Go ahead.
Sure. So I think we'll definitely believe, again, like I said, I've been doing philanthropy for 20 years, and it is really about the relationship, right? And so part of it, I think, where you see funders that are able to really build relationships, be a part of the community, not just kind of sit back in an ivory tower type of position, which is often the perception of philanthropy, and has been some of the paradigm, right, that existed within it for some time. But I think really being out, engaging, reaching out, sending email, making ourselves accessible is really important. But I also, from the strategy of the Institute, and definitely my predecessor is in the room, and I acknowledged her yesterday, but Cheryl Thompson-Morton gave me a really strong foundation on which to build, and that is things like the visioning table, where we have a community advisory board that not only gives advice, but really, is a sounding board. And so when we're rolling out new initiatives, they hear it first, and we get feedback as we set the agenda for this convening. And Jessica can attest, I said, okay, the agenda's been shifted, we've had to make some changes because this is the feedback that we're getting from the community. And as you'll see, or I shared in my opening statement, around Beyond, and so the feedback that we got from this convening 2 years ago very much informed the type of programming that we did, and very much informed our thinking around the Philadelphia Media Founders Exchange. We will be launching at the end of the year a capacity building and general operating support program, grant initiative that, again, is informed by the community. What do folks need? We need money, right? That's what we need money. We need grants, and we need to make ourselves and make these resources accessible. So I think that, one, partnering with the community, two, making ourselves available, and probably the best way is email, or the phone number in my email is my cell phone. Cell phone is probably the better way to send me a text, reach out that way, because, I'm a servant, right? That's my model, is really about building and serving as a servant leader, right? So my leadership is by serving, and so I hope to continue to engage in that way.
Great. Molly, what are you grappling with, and how can people connect with you?
Well, those are two very different questions. Let me start with connecting. I want to echo a lot of what Shawn said, because I think we try to sort of employ the same principles around, always seeking feedback and advice from the community, designing with, not designing for. I think transparency is really key, and it's really hard for funders to bring themselves to be transparent. And we try to do that by writing about our work and just letting people know where we are, and also just, being very honest in our relationships. And as we meet people and try to build trustworthy relationships, we try to be as honest and transparent as possible. And then I think the other piece of that is, the other piece that funders really have a lot of trouble with is accessibility. And I get it, because it can be very overwhelming to try to do a lot of the things that are on your to-do list while also, trying to be as accessible as possible to people who are just trying to navigate the funding world and need some insight and advice. And so, I think funders tend to settle into a place on a spectrum of accessibility where they just get sort of stuck in, I'm going to do only this, I'm going to only be this accessible and not anymore. And I think we at IPMF are always trying to push ourselves to be as accessible as possible, both personally, like having people reach out to us for meetings via in emails and whatnot, but also how we think about our processes too, our grant making processes. So I just think I think accessibility is really, really important. And it's just a high priority for us. And I wish more funders, not my colleagues in the room who are also very accessible funders, but I wish the field in general moved more toward helping people have better insight into philanthropy and how decisions get made and how processes work, and also speaking one-on-one with individuals about their projects, their programs, their organizations. It's a win-win in my opinion for those who reach out and for us too, because we learn a lot too.
Thanks. Diana?
So I'll answer the connecting question first. So the Knight-Lenfest Fund, even though we are both national in scope and also focused hyper-locally in Philadelphia, we're staying in the pool house of the Lenfest Institute, still hanging out with the parents, and so that's where we are housed. And so because of that, the easiest way to find me is by email, and it's just diana@lenfestinstitute.org, but also if you go to the Institute's website, the entire team is very accessible. It's not a form that you fill out and to a general email or something like that. Every single person on the team, if you click on their face, then that's their email. So I think in terms of how opaque an institution can be, these tiny little things, and even having a user-friendly website, that's a point of accessibility. And in terms of how we communicate out, so with our network of grantees and partners, we're very lo-fi, and so our newsletter doesn't use MailChimp or anything like that. It's just email. And it's an e-blast, and the information is populated by our partners and our grantees. Whenever folks send stuff over to us, we piece that together, and more and more things in person, but those are I think some of the easiest ways. And again, I know with the tricky branding confusion, there is not a Knight-Lenfestfund.com or anything like that. And so I think when folks try to find us virtually, and that really leans into, I'll say, like easing into what we grapple with is the reality of time. The sunset is on the horizon. And so I think with a lot of the conversations that we have, we talk about long-term sustainability. We talk about building tech and civic infrastructure for organizations. And for us, it's what happens when you start to wind down. It doesn't make sense to invest in having our own website and things like that. So our stories are housed in, through the Knight Foundation's website, through the Lenfest Institute's website, but also more importantly, through our grantees and partners. And so you don't always need to read about us. Like sometimes you see our logo somewhere, but our work is behind our partners and our grantees, and that's how we shine through them. And so I really want to emphasize that, because our intention is to not spend a lot of time creating an entity that exists for the sake of existing. And but so because of that, we're also a very small team. And again, we emphasize 5 years, and so that's only so much money. So in the scheme of things in the larger funding landscape, we're pretty small. But again, as many of the folks on different panels have said, it's not really about the size or age of the organization, it's what you do with it. It's how you partner, it's how you work on catalytic impact and really ingrain yourself in the communities that you're working in. And so that's something that keeps me up at night sometimes in good ways, because I'll wake up like, oh, I have to write that down. And I just sort of have like notebooks like lying around everywhere for me to jot things without labeling which date. So I'll color code and figure it out later. So I think in terms of, and in a way that hurts is because of the pandemic, knowing that I've not had a chance to meet many of our grantees and partners yet in real life is something that we all grapple with.
So one of the themes that came up when we were preparing for this panel was this idea that journalism can be framed as an act of care, and that those issues relate to the ways that journalists are taking care of themselves, how they're taking care of the community, and how philanthropy can support both of those and more. So would anyone like to jump in and comment on that concept?
Yeah, I'd love to kick off with that. Yes, so definitely within the mutual aid framework and how we approach our work, we really look at journalism as an act of care. And that is, how are we providing care to the communities we serve? And that's also with information, because we don't always want the news to be triggering to open up trauma without any path for solution or, balancing that with stories of joy, with agency, with narratives that are led on the ground and through a grassroots approach. So that when we think about even content or how we support organizations that are working on building trust and relationships with their communities, those are acts of care. We are also thinking about how do you support journalists in newsrooms, not only the ones who are starting or leading local organizations and trying to create jobs, but also the reality of so many of these news organizations who are losing jobs, a lot of reporters who haven't quite figured out their role in the newsrooms of the future, and this fear of being obsolete while at the same time bouncing around different organizations, sometimes within the same ecosystem, sometimes leaving the industry entirely, but the burnout rates. And at the same time, then even with table stakes, we're struggling with, and that's where the community of practice is also the community of support, that news organizations, you get bought up and you lose your jobs partway through. And that's also a reality. And again, so when you think about programming and how to look at sustainability from a care perspective, that's another aspect. And then as a part of that, we also think about how can we have programming that is trauma informed. So when it does happen, and this is something that is difficult for many industries, but it's also difficult for many cultures to talk about mental health, to talk about trauma, to talk about how it affects you, your body, your health, your wellness, and then therefore how it affects those around you in the communities that you're a part of. And so all of that, these are difficult conversations for folks to have. It's difficult to lead those conversations, and because of that, we don't lead them. We put some of our funding is placed in a way that we tell our grantees, we trust you to know what care looks like. And so if there's there's a pot of money, it's a collaborative pot, we trust that within your collaborative how to best delve out those funds. If it's a sponsorship for something that is for capacity building, we trust that you would know which conference, which convening is best for your membership. We're not going to direct you to only two and say you have to go to those, even though we know they're great, but you know better than anyone else in terms of what you need and what your people need and the urgency. And so those are the ways that we think about care and try to operate that way.
Molly, how does this ethos of care translate to your work?
So I'm gonna speak sort of just from my own perspective a little bit, not so much IPMF. I think the idea of strengthening the bonds between journalists and how they connect with communities and center care in those relationships, I think was both a really early piece of work that I worked on at the Dodge Foundation in New Jersey through working with primarily with Free Press and their News Voices program that is working to build bridges between journalists and their communities. And I think has just been a central feature of a lot of the programs that Dodge funded, and also sort of a mindset of how journalism shows up for community that we support through IPMF, through organizations like Resolve and G-Town Info Hub and Kensington Voice and other organizations like that are really reimagining their relationships with communities. So I guess the way I would answer that is, just try to support the organizations that are doing that work and leading by example, and then spending a lot of time pointing to it and talking about it and explaining why it matters and explaining how much it means to people. One of the stories that I've told more than once, so I apologize if anybody there is hearing this more than once, but one of the early activities of Free Press in New Jersey was to host these town hall forums, just to understand, like, how do people feel about their local news and information? What do they need? What do they like? And I think I went to about 10 of these over the course of, a couple of years. And it didn't really matter where it was in New Jersey, whether it was Newark or New Brunswick or Trenton or Atlantic City. The same things kept showing up. And actually a lot of it showed up, I think, in Talia's research around people don't feel like they have the information that they need. There's too much of a focus on negative stories. And you could really, it was the sense of pain that people felt was very palpable. The people from the community about how it's not that they didn't care about journalism or hated it as an institution. It's that they were desperate for it to be a force for good in their communities. And so I think, that was a real formative experience for me to hear from all those different communities around the state and try to focus on how you resource leaders and organizations who understand that, who understand that need to serve communities and be a force for good. And so I think that's just how, we've tried to do it is to give as much encouragement to those who are already doing the work that way, and explaining why that's important and why we support it.
Thoughts on CARE, Shawn?
Great question, and I think that it is really for us about how we structure the programming, right? And so the thinking about how we build care and looking at ways in which there is inequities in the market, right? And so how are we, helping to contribute to shifting the way the market is operating, right? And so we look at programs like the Next Generation Fund, where we looked at where there are still, it continues to exist, a gap in terms of the opportunities that BIPOC emerging journalists and journalism students have to attend conferences, to not have, somebody mentioned it the other day, or I think it was when we were maybe having lunch, right, that they went to journalism school but couldn't afford to do the, work for free thing, right? And so we built in, scholarships for unpaid internships for people who can't afford to work for free, right? So let's provide funding. That's CARE. When I think about some of the feedback that we got from some of the entrepreneurs in the Philadelphia Media Founders Exchange, where we gave $10,000, $5,000 up front, $5,000 at the end, as well as opportunities for follow-on funding in between. And it was some people saying, this is the first time I've been able to pay myself, right? That we're doing this work and we're just doing what we need to do to make it happen, but being able to, take a breath, right? Pay some bills, hire a contractor, hire someone to do these things, and not just because, we're building their capacity, but this is what you need to breathe in order to do this work. And that really engaging with people, and it's not by chance that Molly and IPMF and Diana and the Knight-Lenfest Fund are partners in this work, right? Because it's an ethos that we all bring to this, and where we see like-mindedness and efforts and ability to amplify and build that work up and continue to grow it, I think it's all, kind of speaks to this ethos that runs through our approach to doing this work.
And I think that pain that Molly was talking about, that pain of not feeling represented, not feeling seen, not being seen as legitimate, that's true too when you have funders who don't look like you, don't share your lived experience. So when we were preparing for this panel, you were reflecting a bit on how important that is too, and what you've heard from grantees about that.
Absolutely, and I will say, particularly with the Philadelphia Media Founders Exchange, which was, kind of birthed with me, Cheryl, Roxanne, and then as Diana came on, and we're working with funders, and it was, and as I said, I've been doing this work for a long time, and when I was at the Philadelphia Foundation 15 years ago, and we built out the capacity building initiative there, funders were grantees were very wary, right? Because the tradition, the usual paradigm is the dog and pony show. You show us all of our shiny sides, and then you'll think that we're worthy of your grant dollars. But we're saying, and particularly with this initiative, was we want to partner with you. We want to understand what you need, right? And folks weren't used to hearing that. They weren't used to having that relationship. And then it also is a different approach that we bring as, funders of color that have grown up in some similar experiences, that have a shared history and a shared learning around, the issues that folks are facing, and not because we're journalists in the space, right? But because we're Black, we're Hispanic, we're Asian, people who grew up in these communities understanding some of the issues that folks are struggling with, and can bring a perspective that, and not because Jim isn't a compassionate person, right? But he doesn't have that same lived experience, right? And having a lived experience brings a lot to the work, and allows you to not only just speak the same language, but empathize in a very different way. And I think that's also what we're seeing and heard from Latrell, right, when we're talking about newsrooms, right, where you don't have folks that have leadership that has the same lived experience, that it's often, there are blind spots. There are things that you don't perceive and understand, or even understand how people hear you, right, because you're not thinking about it the same way. And I think that goes a long way in really being able to build authentic relationships in community.
Anything else you'd like the room to know before we open up the floor?
Hey, Jess, could we just go back really quickly to, I wanted to comment on Shawn's comment about how people say, this is the first time I was able to pay myself. Because this is something we hear a lot too, particularly with the filmmaking grants that we make. And, you said earlier, this kind of ties in both to the lived experience, in that if you as a funder either haven't ever scraped by in a nonprofit existence, in your career, or if you haven't experienced poverty, I think it's really hard to deeply understand what it is like to be out there, to be the nonprofit with your hat in your hand at all times trying to raise money. So I think it is important for funders to really understand that. But then also you asked earlier about what are our challenges? And I think that, one of the biggest challenges I feel is everything costs way more than you think it will. And it is very hard to convey this to the decision makers, to, whether it's your funding colleagues or other funders that you're trying to convince to join you, or, the board in your organization or other staff. If you want to change systems, it requires a level of funding that is actually going to get you to change systems. And it's not enough to do general operating support. It's not enough to do capacity building support. Like, we as funders have to open ourselves up to hearing all the other ways in which money is needed. And a lot of times it feels to funders like, well, I don't want to fund that thing because that's like taking 2 steps backwards before we can go forward. And the truth is, well, that's what you have to do. And I think this concept around paying yourself is a real clear manifestation of that, right? Like, we make these grants that don't allow people to pay themselves. And then we, at times, I think, take umbrage at, like, the money required to make sure that people feel fairly compensated, especially across collaborations, right? Like, everybody has to get paid across collaborations so that everybody can show up and participate in the way that they want to. And so I just think this is an area, there's a lot to unpack in philanthropy about people's personal relationship to money and how those biases and lived experiences around money are often a barrier to actually matching the resources with the needs in the field.
Thank you, Molly. Too true. Anything else you'd like to add?
I'd like to speak a little bit about it is, I feel like I am in a unique situation. I have not spent that much time as a funder of color. I only joined the fund in October of last year, so getting to a year. But I think, having worked I was a grantee, and I've been in that work, been lucky enough to be a beneficiary of many of the funders in the room. So I managed the Germantown Info Hub, which was funded both by the Knight-Lenfest Fund, but also by IPMF. And we're also Lenfest Sunshinees. And so, to sort of like be a small news project that was able to grow alongside, while simultaneously, the work and the research that Latrell and Andrea did, paving the way to understand the information needs of the Germantown community and then how to shape that organization. That was an approach that was relatively irregular, I think, in the scheme of how a lot of news organizations tend to start up. The tide is changing, but so to do that work, to have been a community engagement editor, to come from another industry, many of the organizations I've either worked for or with have been grantees, including some of the Community Voices Fund recipients that is also in partnership with IPMF and Health Sparks Foundation. And again, that emphasis that, I worked for community organizations and nonprofits, thank you, that were not journalism organizations, but they still had a role in changing who can control and tell narratives, and what storytelling and resource sharing looks like, and what different pieces of media looks like. And so I've done that work, and I've also been in a position working through the nonprofit industrial complex, where I was always I worked on special projects that were housed within parent institutions, and was really working to set them up and really ingrain them in the organization for both a cultural and financial, sustainable fit. But as a part of that, and especially working in Philadelphia for so long, I was a part of the ecosystem, when you don't think about it just as a news ecosystem, but all the stakeholders and communities that are ingrained within that. I feel like in many ways I've worked on the same issues, I'm just at a different seat at the table now. And so I think that allows for me, even though I've only been with the fund for less than a year, has allowed for me to really hit the ground running, because some of this work, not only am I familiar with it, I've been on the other side of it. And I think that in the same way that we talk about news organizations needing to build trust in their communities, philanthropy needs to build trust with their news organizations and the communities that the news organizations serve. And I'm lucky to be in a position where some of, because those relationships have been built, they are sustained regardless of what role I play. And I think that allows for me to be better at the work that I do, but also how that plays out. And again, this was not something that I started, but with the fund, we work in partnership with our grantees as their applicants also. And so aside from the open calls, the applications, each project is designed in partnership with the applicants so that they identify the pain points, they identify their opportunities, but they also set their metrics because, again, we're trying to learn alongside them. So who are we to tell them to go with archaic metrics that have failed news organizations already, especially when we're talking about better reaching underserved communities and looking for new revenue streams? Clicks, follows, subscriptions, opens, important. They're not the only things that really talk about how you best reach and serve a community, especially if you're looking at it from a community organizing lens. And so I think all of that, whether or not people see me necessarily in themselves, and especially knowing that I am a lighter skinned, assigned female at birth individual, that, I only reflect so many people in Philadelphia. But I think my lived experience and my work experience allows for me to be more approachable in my work, but also hopefully come with a more compassionate lens when I try to interact with new partners.
Great. Last thought, Shawn?
Oh, yeah, I would just say that, I think, I hope that folks are understanding and grasping, one, that we want to be in relationship. We want to be in partnership with you as we continue to build out and do this work. And just the critical importance, I think, of one, as both Molly and Diana have shared, one, being accessible, being open. I'm here for the difficult conversations. I want to wrestle with, how is it that we can continue to be better at doing what we do and making sure that we are in service to you, to make sure that we're in service to the community, and that, we're doing that, again, not hiding behind anything. We're here for the difficult conversations. I welcome that. And continue to walk with it, and that we can have those conversations and still partner together and make sure that we're all on the same page.
Great. So in the spirit of continually learning together, which we've all had to do much more of these past few years, let's open the floor. Who's got questions? Over here? Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Shimika Sawyer. I am the creator of the Five Shorts Project. I've been teaching my community how to create short films since 2014, which I supply everything they need. They don't have to come to the table with anything, not even knowledge of how to make a short film. What I want to ask is that I noticed both IPMF and Lenfest and Knight-Lenfest, you guys reduced the barrier to entry for grants. Prior to receiving funding from all of you, it was very hard for small organizations like myself, which was just me, to get a grant because we didn't fit a certain or meet a certain criteria. Do you think that more funders will follow that model and making it just a little bit easier on us to apply and receive funding?
I definitely can't necessarily speak for other funders, but it was a conscious decision to make, to lower the bar. Not lower the bar, because we still have expectations of our grantees, and to Diana's point, right? We will work with you around understanding what the metrics are, how are we measuring, how are we learning, because there's a ton of information that we gain by working closely with the grantees around the metrics, which is why, as we worked with Jessica and got great input from Joss, as we published our metrics, right, and how we are tracking information, what is it that we're measuring, and I think part of that is also making sure that, we are not creating, undue barriers to organizations, because in order for these organizations to grow, you've got to gain entry, you got to get in the door, right? And then we can build and grow together. But so will that permeate to other organizations? I think, as we can continue to model and both share what we're learning, right, our step out in terms of lowering those barriers, and folks can see that these are still worthwhile investments to make, and we can produce that evidence, my hope is that other people will continue.
I think I can only speak to funders that I've worked with. I think some things that I've noticed, especially with the pandemic, is the realization if there are certain things that make your major funding or even your application process inaccessible, if you have a mission behind who you're trying to reach, and especially if it was housed around immediate aid, I think a lot of funders were thinking more about how accessible their info sessions were if they weren't able to do them online, and also realizing if you have an exact cutoff time and it's only on your website and somebody finally took the time to beta test your website and found that the link was dead or that you had to navigate this way or that, but you needed to download as a PDF and print it out, write it in person, then fax it over. Somebody set that up and did not think to update it 10 years ago along with your website. And so, especially as organizations, we're trying to figure out how to better use Zoom. We were talking about how do you do information sessions, especially say if you're working with an organization that was, and this is not for the Knight-Lenfest Fund, but for a partner organization, if you're trying to work to support women experiencing poverty, and many of them don't have access to computers, and you used to have in-person workshops so you could provide Chromebooks to work alongside them to go through that application. What does that look like now? So I think not everyone has the solutions, but the problems and the issue with the very core basic logistics of even getting to the door to be considered, I think funders are seeing more and more how problematic that is.
Yeah. We have a question in the back. And Molly, you got anything quick to say while we run the mic over?
All I would say is if you are a funder talking about having any kind of conversation about racial equity and justice, you cannot ever get to equity and justice if you're not reducing the barriers to entry and not being extremely intentional about getting capital to those who have been denied capital. And it's pretty simple. So it's a very intentional choice on our part. And I think we have an imperative as funders to help other funders see that light too. And I hope that others will continue to call out funders who are saying one thing and doing another.
Thank you. Paul?
Hi, I have two questions. So the first question is great that a lot of funders have reduced the barriers to entry, but a lot of funders also just fund freshmen and seniors and expect these folks suddenly go from your $50,000 grant, which might seem a lot from the get-go, to suddenly be able to scale, and then just like VC, it takes like a decade of multiple big rounds of seed funding, right, for things to truly scale. But in journalism philanthropy, it's sort of like a lot of mini grants, but where do you go beyond the mini grants? And isn't that in itself not helping the people who could succeed? So that's one question. The second question is also great that we're seeing that funders are funding sort of new entrepreneurs of colors as well as BIPOC publishers who have traditionally been underfunded. But do you also feel that it might be a bias against legacy media, right? So for example, people like me and Sarah, I'm just gonna throw your name, we are coming into legacy media to try to change, but every time that we meet some funders, they say, oh, we have invested in you already. Never mind that we are basically the first or the second leaders of color into an organization. So where is our pathway to success?
Interesting. Provocative questions at the last minute. Setting us up for the next conversation. Let's gather that last question here, and then we'll do a lightning round of responses.
Okay. So I'm going to just say that I'm not settled, but I want to maintain my health. So sorry about that. Hopefully you can hear me through. Yes? Great. So I really appreciate, Paul, your second question, because I don't have a question, I have a comment. And I just wanted to thank Lenfest for putting on this program, and also for being an organization that actually is about the muscle of the work. And many people in this room have been doing this work for decades. And by the way, I'm Sarah Glover, the new VP of News at WHYY, if you can't see me. And I just wanted to acknowledge the ecosystem here in Philadelphia for really trying to break down the barriers and the issues. And for me, I look at it through the lens of just straight out equity. I mean, when I'm thinking about the conversations that we're having here today, it just brings me back to the word equity. And how am I every day practicing equity in my news organization and in the networks that I'm a part of, and really doing that in an enriching way and in an empowering way. And I think we all can play a role in that. And I would say over the last year or two, I've spent quite a bit of time really focusing on making sure that it's not just the burden of journalists of color. And so I wanted to just echo into the room that you have my, my embrace and my support, because many of us are traumatized and tired. But we are still standing and we're here, and we need support. And we need to validate each other, but we also need support. And so I appreciated lots of the comments on the panel, because this work costs. There is a cost involved. It's an actual dollar amount, and we need to continue to see that investment. And I wanted to really clearly acknowledge Lenfest for the work they're doing, not just to write a check, but the engagement, putting this conference on, the level of, the conversations I've seen in the hall, the sparking of creativity. But back to Paul's comment, and I'll just share this with you, and it kind of amplifies what he just stated. A funder came to me over the summer and asked if I knew of an org that they could contact to send money to work on an equity project. And I said, why wouldn't you identify a leader in a newsroom or within an organization that's doing the work and help fund the work that they're doing? And, I really tried to have that conversation, and it really speaks to Paul's comment that whether it's me or Paul or someone else in the room, sending resources to a predominantly white journalism organization that has one equity project is not the work that needs to be done today. We actually do need to find ways to further fund and support the journalists of color who've been doing this work at every level, from independent media all the way up to leading a large organization. And we do still need help and support. So with that, again, I just, for the third time, want to say thank you, Lenfest. It feels good to be here in the room, and I congratulate you on your work.
Thank you for both for your perspectives and your questions. Any last thoughts? How do we support the people who've been doing the work a while? And how do we support the legacy folks who are trying to reimagine themselves?
So, legacy first, I think probably a very proud example is the WHYY NICE team and network, and when I say network, I really mean the network of partners. And so that is one where we do have a project within a larger legacy newsroom, and it's one where the two leads are also folks who I would say identify as community organizers before necessarily being media makers, and now maybe it's getting closer and closer together. But even in in your roles which have community engagement in the name, how you have then worked with the partners, from the foundation, and again, that was also designed in partnership with Sandy Clark, Roxanne, and Chris in that famous whiteboard session, but how that's played out also in working with grassroots content creators and treating WHYY not as an overseeing body, but as a partner in the collective is a shift in thinking, while at the same time recognizing very real power dynamics, and also the reality that you need to have for most any sort of exchange of money investment, whether you're borrowing, whether you're getting a grant, you need to be structured in a way that you can receive funding. You need to have, at times people want to look for a track record. Sometimes people want to see, oh, another funder had given you X amount. I feel more comfortable about investing in something. I don't always want to be the early adopter. There is a combination of forces that are at play in a capitalist society. But if we want to fund collaboratives, we also want to fund and help work with WHYY as they're working on this project, but also working with the grassroots content creators and all the individual communities that they serve and represent. That helps broaden WHYY's reach also at the same time, in a very symbiotic relationship where they're sharing content. They have a lot of the nice network partners are then featured. They co-report with other HYY reporters in the newsroom. That is something that uplifts all boats. And I think that's one approach that I'd like to say is pretty successful. And also, nominated for awards, and so other people also believe it's successful. And I think also as an extension of that, that NICE 2.0 was designed with the partners helped design that next iteration of the grant. And so and even though it was not a charge that every content creator or news organization as a part of NICE is a media maker of color, because it's in Philadelphia, that naturally plays out as just a makeup that is representative of the city. And I would say that something like that compared to also URL Media, which is newer, but again, is a collective. And so we're just different ways of both funding newer projects that are doing this work, but also with a network of organizations that are older and younger, because intergenerational work is just stronger. Intergenerational, multi-platform, multiple lessons, different backgrounds, all of that, you'll naturally have a more diversified staff, audience and community, and revenue streams, because you're just bringing in so many different resources that you can then share and teach with each other. So I think, and especially if you're thinking about ROI, that's where catalytic impact can happen. So I mean, I guess that's part of balancing the bias, but I also realize there's time, so I'm gonna stop.
Thank you. Well, thank you for your complex and rich thinking.
Don't
Molly,
you ask me
anything-
complex questions. This is what you'll get.
Well, we heard earlier today from Latrell, complex answers to complex problems. Molly, anything you want to close with?
Oh, gosh. So I guess I just had two thoughts come to mind. First of all, hi, Paul. Hi, Sarah. I can't see you, but thank you for those questions. I think fundamentally, so I'm not sure I agree that there's a bias against legacy media. I bet the data would bear out that legacy media gets more money. I don't know, I could be wrong about that, but I think fundamentally that question is about, for funders is, are you working inside the system of legacy media? Are you working outside the system and building up independent media, or are you doing some of both? And we do some of both. And, I think, I don't know if Chris Norris is in the room, but obviously he is an absolute gem at WHYY, and we care a lot about the work that he's leading there, and we support that. And I think it's really important to support the leaders inside the legacy media institutions that are pushing for change, even if you don't have full buy-in at the top. And then I think the other thing that's sort of underneath what I'm hearing in these questions and comments is, philanthropy by design is everyone doing their own thing, right? That's what's so maddening about it, and the way in which it sort of upholds inequity and white supremacy is everybody doing their own thing. And I think maybe what you're hearing, maybe you're hearing what you like from us three today or not, I don't know. But if you are, what's so frustrating is then you go out in the world and you talk to other funders and they don't sound anything like us, right? Or some don't, some do, some don't. And it's really challenging to navigate all of that. And I think the way that I've always thought about that is just, it is imperative for us to keep pushing our colleagues to be more accessible, to be more transparent, to be more equitable in our work, be more intentional. And so, and because it's so much harder for nonprofits to be the ones doing the challenging, right? There's such a power imbalance there that it's incumbent upon us to really push our peers to do better.
Thank you, Molly. All right, I'm going to segue. We're going to give Shawn the floor and Andrea, and so I will steal your last word.
That's all right.
And give it to you later. All right, thanks everybody.